This is the least elegant lapel mic I've ever seen. Okay, I'm gonna deliver the talk like this. Mild look of terror, optional. I'll just hold it. Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, today I'm going to be discussing game narrative stuff. My talk is called Once Upon a Design, and I am called Rodain Nandrew Joubert. I work for QCF Design. We're an outfit over in Tableview responsible for desktop dungeons and other crimes against humanity. Let's get right to it. So today I'll be discussing the interactions between game design and game narrative and how anyone can use good development practice to improve their writing. Excuse the captions over here. I never prepare any of my speeches more than 5 minutes in advance. Although it's important to respect the work done by writers and the field of writing and what it can bring to game design, I am going to be approaching this strictly from the angle of game designers looking outside at writing towards the end. Just because, well, most of the audience here, I can assume, consider themselves developers first and authors second. If any of you are writers, I hope that I can still teach you something new and interesting, so here goes. Chapter 1, a core similarity. All creative fields have their idiosyncrasies and their own unique approaches to issues, but there are also areas of accord and resonance that occur between all these things. The most important thing being that simplicity is king. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, once said, "A designer knows he has achieved perfection not when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away." Some of you may know this as Leonard Nimoy's quote when you research engineering in Civilization 4. In good game design, we tend to take this to heart. You don't design 10 kinds of weapons where one will do, and you certainly don't barrage the player with grind tasks and shit chores that nobody really finds fun or just wastes time. In a similar vein, the field of writing also finds value in simplicity and elegance, particularly in the areas of journalism and public speaking, where less tends to be more. Yet, when game designers come into the field of writing and start attaching stories to their work, they often provide a novella of words to players whenever the story time emerges, forgetting the importance of being brief. Narrative-driven RPGs and adventure games are particular culprits of this, and it's not unusual to fire up an indie project and find yourself confronted with a wall of text. This generates a lot of forgettable storytelling in a very literal sense. If you front-load too much lore and other unnecessary information to players who've just been introduced to your game, they're going to forget about it before they've learned to start caring about it. And that's not good for anyone. Unless, of course, you use unskippable cutscenes to tell your story, in which case you will piss everyone off. You may be tempted to believe that there are exceptions to this rule, but there aren't. Not at all. Even likely culprits, such as story-heavy RPGs, actually do need to respect the word economy themselves. Just because there are more words in your game doesn't mean that you're allowed to get laissez-faire with them. Interactive fiction, which is pretty much just words, also benefits from brevity, conciseness, and respecting the word economy. Making the word equivalent of an MMO is not an excuse to get sloppy, it just means that you've made your job that much more difficult. So, we move on to the idea of information spread and how you can treat the structure of your narrative much like the structure of any game design. It's often helpful to think of narrative in the same way as these games, especially if you take it from the tutorial aspect. The simplest concepts are often explained up front in safe, focused scenarios, with more complicated information and concepts being delivered later. In-game narrative, this can also be used to provide a simple skeleton up front of the most vital information, while you leave more juicy details for the latter parts of the game as the player learns to become comfortable in the world that you've provided them with. Once you figure out what you want to say up front, say only that and nothing more, even if this means saying nothing at all. For example, if we have a hypothetical medieval hack and slash game where you find yourself landing on level 1, you're a knight raiding a castle. Cool. You have to hit bad guys, you'll get an instruction on the screen saying click on baddie to make them die, and you do so with much vigor and enthusiasm. This introduces you both to the basic concepts of the game and the basic concepts of the story. On level 2, you may start finding a sort of sophistication element coming in. So you're required to put the skills you've just learned to a bit more of a live fire or practical scenario. And you can start dropping hints to the player about why they're in this castle and, what their motivation is. As the game carries on through level 3 and onwards, you're going to be consolidated, introduced to new controls, given all of your special moves, and thrust into the game properly. Reveal for all intents and purposes that you are trying to rescue a damsel in distress. Continue the game like this, escalating the challenge. Combat situations become difficult enough to kill the player if they're not attentive. Puzzles become difficult enough to stump the player if they're not attentive. And platforming challenges become capable of frustrating the player if they're not quick enough to press A. In the same way, narrative can become more complicated, and you may have to look out for more subtle details or pay a little bit more attention in class when the history lessons are given. For this position that you are at in the game, this becomes more and more acceptable. Oh, and the damsel is your sister and or the queen, whatever. But at the end of the game, you can present your greatest gameplay challenges and the greatest narrative challenges to the player all at once. You might have a twist in the tale, you might have something particularly detailed or intense or emotional. It's the payoff both in terms of mechanics and story. For example, perhaps the damsel wasn't a damsel at all. Your entire endeavor was a Don Quixote delusion fueled by exposure to gender stereotypes and weird mana potions. Or maybe the experience changed your character in some way. Maybe the damsel got rescued halfway through the game or wasn't there at all, and the focus has changed to your own internal mindset and the growth that you've experienced during the game for better, or, as is often the case in video games, for worse. Kind of like the exposure of Tony Stark's fragile psyche with his nervous breakdowns in the later Iron Man movies, even though I believe that is one of the weakest pieces of schlock and mental investigation that I have had the misfortune to encounter in film in recent years. I'm sorry. Without getting too spoilery, Castlevania Lord of Shadow is actually a really good example of narrative progress and increase in complexity being tied in with the other game elements. I don't think it's the best story ever, but it's certainly a great example of what I'm trying to show here. For example, combat gets more difficult as you go through the game, puzzles get more complicated, platforming challenges become a lot more interesting, yada yada yada. But while that's happening, the narrative is also forcing you to think steadily more and more about what's happening. To the extent where by the end of the game, you're doing a lot of stuff which feels really grey and questionable and thought-provoking as a player. Often even making you uncomfortable. Even though at the very beginning of the game you were just ruffle-stumping a bunch of werewolves attacking some generic village. As an added note, you shouldn't be scared if you are wanting to create a complex and involved story of scaring away players with the simplicity of narrative at the beginning. Everything has to start somewhere, and game designers face the same challenge. When they want to create a deep and involved and inspiring game system, they still have to introduce it one element at a time. So before you start on your epic fantasy in the world of who the fuck cares, make sure that you get some who's to give a fuck first. Even Game of Thrones just started with 3 guys grumbling in a frozen forest. I'm going to stop reading out these chapters. Nowadays, it's common for games to present their audience with a sort of tiered system, you know, where different levels of challenge are provided to different audience bases, and not everybody gets to experience 100% of the game. In short, this is built with different tastes and different attention spans in mind, and the best games are all about understanding and accepting this. Sometimes in the case of hidden collectibles or secret rooms and bonus missions, this obfuscation is actually intended, and people have to go out of their way to discover all the content. I think you know where I'm going with this. Narrative follows the same rules. When writing narrative for a game, it's easy to fall in love with your words and build them with the idea that the player should experience everything, like some sort of verbal ambrosia. Often, though, it's just better to let go and understand that not everybody actually wants to hear your story, or at least not all of it. Sometimes players will skip through every single bit of non-critical dialogue that they can, and the occasional bit of actually critical dialogue. It's often a good idea to accommodate this by finding the core of your story and making sure that you focus on that, presenting that to as many players as possible, while leaving other extras in other places. For example, with Desktop Dungeons, not to be too much of an advertiser here, focuses heavily on tiered narrative and making sure that bits of the story are presented as necessary to players who actually want to discover them. The game script weighs in at about 60,000 words. Wow, that's ironic. A little longer than the average NaNoWriMo project, and is designed in such a way that the audience doesn't even have to read about 90% of it. Although a basic plotline is offered, you know, the rise, decay, and eventual renaissance of a kingdom built around hunting and slaying evil, the more detailed story is largely hidden from most of the audience and is actually quite different from the happy-go-lucky, cheerful kingdom presented on the surface. Some aspects of the tale are hidden behind high-skill challenges, some are squirreled away in remote codex entries, and still others are put in hidden sub-dungeons and random events. And there is at least one reported case where a bug prevents you from reading most of the text at all. Even the most in-your-face literature, that being the critical tutorial messages, often have sections highlighted for people who don't want to waste their time on flavor text. For lack of better phrasing, you shouldn't let your ego drive the way you tell a story. You should accept that not everybody wants to hear your tale. You know, in the same way that not everybody's going to like your game. And should instead focus on pleasing the people who will feel rewarded by it, who will go to the effort of uncovering those extra bits of information and seeking the emotional payoff from that. You'll end up with a mixture of actively rewarded and reasonably satisfied players instead of a whole swath of angry people who got tales unwillingly shoved down their throats. So here's a couple of other things to know. First of all, writing is just as subject to the prototype and revision process as any other aspect of design. When you're doing concept art, when you're doing coding, when you're doing game design, there's always the acceptance that you're going to go through multiple revisions, that you're going to change some things that were a certain way at the beginning, and maybe even cut out entire sections that aren't really useful anymore. You don't have to have your entire story sorted and bound up in a folder before you start anything else. This mentality is especially important when changes to other aspects of the design affect the logical flow of your narrative. For example, the backstory of the Transmuters in Desktop Dungeons was changed 3 times due to character redesigns in the mechanical side. All that matters is the end product, so even if your lore is a bit hazy here and there, as long as the final product all makes sense, by the time you get to the polish era, you're doing fine. If you're really worried about lore and consistency, you can always just leave information out and let the audience use their imagination. Play your cards right, and you can actively tantalize and intrigue players, you know, inspire their imaginations in the same way that Dark Souls actually does very effectively. Although I should note that Dark Souls is consistent and very tightly interlinked in what information it does present. Also remember that there's lots of ways to tell your story which don't rely strictly on verbiage. For example, artwork and background effects are surprisingly large part of a lot of storytelling. A long hall with a dozen statues and one destroyed one tells a lot of stories without using any words at all. The rules and design of your game can also be intertwined with narrative more directly. So, although it's not the supreme example of great storytelling, I am going to refer to a moment in Diablo 2 when Deckard Cain conveniently mentions to you that the Act 1 boss is somewhat averse to fire. Ooh, so guess which damage type you're going to take into that battle. There also exists what I like to call the one-button game approach to narrative, where the simplicity rule is taken to the extreme to build a meaningful and compelling tale using only the very minimum of actual overt storytelling. Journey is an excellent example of this, where there's no script at all, and in fact not even any player communication except for a high-pitched shriek that you can use with one of your buttons. Passage and other art games also tend to fit the bill. And Dark Souls is close to this, although in our metaphor it's probably more akin to a two-button game. How much time am I? I'm good? Oh, sweet. Well then, I'm going to go into a very long, boring, and detailed case study of one game in particular. There's a hell of a lot to discuss in the field of game narrative, and this talk could best be described as just a very small primer for what's actually a far more detailed field, even in the narrow area which I've discussed with you today. I would, however, like to point out the Thief series as a particularly excellent example of a story that follows game design principles to the extent where it can actually integrate itself with the gameplay constantly. From the very beginning, you'll find yourself listening in on random conversations and uncovering plot details and mechanical importance. This is all well and good, but there's a few clever tricks which spice this up considerably. Here's where the wall text starts. First of all, game hints and mechanical information. A more subtle take on the earlier Diablo example, conversations between characters in the Thief series often contain information which actively helps the player negotiate their current situation. For example, you could be overhearing two guards talking about where they left the keys lost, or muttering about a particular security machine that doesn't work in one corner of the building. Because these often provide very important mechanical advantages to the player in the game, they're actually compelled to listen in on these otherwise flavor conversations to see if they can pick up bits and pieces of important information. It's a lovely example of forcing you to roleplay as that scoundrel to whom information and cunning is actually the most important weapon. Enjoying the narrative also presents an actual game challenge. So on the one hand, you are listening to these conversations in the hopes of gaining an advantage in the game. On the other hand, there's often a very real risk associated with listening to these conversations. Eavesdropping isn't always a safe activity. Sometimes a guard will randomly stroll across your path while you're leaning in at a door. And sometimes, there'll be a few scripted following missions where the entire goal of the mission is to be able to hear what's being said by a moving target who is throwing a whole bunch of inconvenient obstacles in your way that only a thief can really negotiate with. So if you want some story, well, that's cool, but you are going to have to work for it. Fully organic cutscenes. By this I mean that you don't just get locked out of player control and have to watch a scene unfolding before you. You don't even have to resort to that sort of fake cutscene involvement, which assumes that Gordon Freeman has nothing better to do than hop around the furniture in a science lab while some teleport resonance theory is being explained to him. If the sheriff and thief gets murdered, guess who has to run and hide and find their own little corner of the room to sneak into when the guards come bursting in and discover the dead body? You're not hiding because the game is shoehorning you into making sure that you're staying still in one place for a while. You're hiding because that's what you're used to doing all the time. You're listening to the guards, you're listening to the story unfold, but you're also keeping an eye out for emergency exits. You're keeping an eye out for an ear out for important information. You're actually still playing the game while you're enjoying the cutscene, and in a way that's completely organic. And finally, I would like to mention a particular instance from the game Thief 2, where there was something of a narrative masterstroke. Thief 2 contained a scene which actually managed to elicit genuine player emotion and mechanical investment with just a single line of dialogue. As Garrett, the player was required to listen at a specific door to gain information to progress the plot. They couldn't see the characters that they were eavesdropping on, but they could hear everything that was going on in the room, right down to the footsteps. Now, at a particular point in the conversation, one of the actors instructs another one to go fetch our visitor waiting outside. And in a situation where the player happens to be waiting outside a door, listening to these people, you can understand that that's a very terrifying sentence to hear. Have you been discovered? Are they going to get you now? As you listen to the footsteps getting closer and closer to the door, the player is also reminded of the very primal fear that has been trained into them, that loud footsteps equals bad news. Over these few tense seconds where the player is considering staying or fleeing or, readying a weapon of some kind for the worst case scenario, you find that the person concerned was actually opening up another door next to yours. So you were actually safe after all. There's a huge sigh of relief, and you realize that you feel a little bit silly because absolutely nothing was designed to happen to you. This would not have worked in another game. A lot of players would have assumed that in the context of a cutscene or a scripted event, they would have been safe. A lot of players would have assumed that they'd just be able to sit and passively listen to the conversation and that things would just take their course. But Thief spent the entire game up to that point training you to get rid of that idea, just so that they could spring this panic situation on you. There were no established safe zones, footsteps mean doom, and things can get very bad very quickly if you're ever discovered. And that's why I think it's actually an absolute masterstroke of how narrative can actually affect players' engagement immediately with the mechanical game situation at hand. And that's the end of my nerd rant. Thanks for listening to my talk on narrative.